I never used to check my locks twice. Growing up in a small town where everyone knew your porch light better than your name, safety wasn't a choice, it was just the atmosphere. But that changed last November. I'm telling this story now because I finally moved out of that house, and even 300 miles away, I still find myself staring at the gap under my bedroom door every night at 3 a.m. Some things don't just leave you, they wait. I had just started a new job working remote for a tech firm. I needed a quiet place, so I rented an old Victorian on the outskirts of the city. It was cheaper than it should have been, but I ignored that. The first week was perfect, just me, my laptop, and the sound of the wind through the pines. The first red flag happened on a Tuesday. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard a distinct thud from directly above me, the attic. I figured it was just a squirrel or the house settling into the cold, but when I went up there with a flashlight, I found the small circular window, the one I had personally latched shut the day I moved in, wide open. The latch wasn't broken, it was simply slid back. I locked it, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather, and went back to work. 3 nights later, I woke up to the smell of old copper and wet earth. It was thick, like someone had dragged a swamp into my hallway. I checked my phone, 3:14 a.m. I stayed paralyzed in bed, listening. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate click-drag, coming from the hallway. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy chain, but muffled, as if the chain was wrapped in velvet. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the silence that followed was worse. I realized the dragging had stopped right outside my bedroom door. I watched the handle. It didn't turn. Instead, I saw a shadow flicker in the gap at the bottom of the door. Someone was standing there, perfectly still, just breathing. No, not breathing. They were sniffing. Long, deep inhalations, like they were trying to catch my scent through the wood. I didn't yell. I couldn't. I crawled toward my window, thinking I could drop to the porch roof, but as I reached the glass, I saw a reflection in the pane. My bedroom door was now cracked open just an inch. In the darkness of the hallway, I didn't see a face. I saw a hand. It was unnaturally long, the skin a pale bruised gray, gripping the edge of the doorframe. The fingers weren't just long, they had too many knuckles. The hand began to slide upward, higher than any normal person could reach, until it gripped the very top of the doorframe. And then a voice, a wet, raspy imitation of my own voice, whispered from the dark. "It's just the house settling, right?" I didn't wait. I threw myself through the window, took the fall onto the bushes, and ran to my car in my socks. I didn't look back until I was at a gas station 5 miles away. The police found the attic window open again. No forced entry, no footprints in the dust. But they did find something that made the lead officer go pale. In the crawl space directly above my bed, they found a small pile of my own discarded mail, a single tuft of my own hair, and a nest made of shredded insulation. I live in a modern apartment now, no attics, no crawl spaces, but sometimes when it's very quiet, I hear a long inhalation coming from the vent above my stove.
Working the graveyard shift at a highway gas station is usually just a repetitive cycle of cold coffee, humming fluorescent lights, and the occasional trucker passing through. But the stretch of Road 42 has a way of making you feel like you're the only living person left on Earth. The fog there doesn't just sit, it crawls, swallowing the asphalt until the world ends 10 feet past the front windows. It was exactly 3:42 a.m. when a rusted black sedan, its paint peeling like dead skin, rolled silently into the lot and stopped at pump number 4. I watched the security monitors, waiting for the driver to step out and swipe a card, but the car just sat there idling. The engine made a wet, rhythmic knocking sound, and the headlights cut through the mist like 2 dim, jaundiced eyes staring into the store. 10 minutes passed. My skin began to prickle. I was used to weirdos, but there was a stillness to this car that felt heavy, like it was weighted down by something more than just a driver. Finally, the driver's side door creaked open, a sound like a rusted gate being forced. A man stepped out, but he didn't look toward the gas pump or his fuel door. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the lot, his body angled toward the glass front of the station, staring directly at me through the window. He was draped in a heavy wool coat that looked decades old, stained and frayed at the hem, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his entire face into a void of shadow. I felt a cold, hard knot tighten in my stomach. I looked down at my register, pretending to count the drawer, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I gathered the courage to look back up, the lot was empty. The car was still idling, but the man had vanished. I scanned the monitors frantically, my eyes darting from the pumps to the car wash to the dumpsters. Nothing. Then, the electronic chime above the front door shrieked, making me jump so hard I nearly knocked the register off the counter. The man was inside. He didn't walk. He moved with a strange, hitching gait, his boots thudding heavily against the linoleum with a wet, sucking sound. He didn't head for the snacks, the coffee, or the restrooms. He walked in a straight line to the counter and stopped 2 feet away. Up close, the smell was unbearable. A suffocating stench of wet fur, stagnant swamp water, and something metallic like old copper coins. I kept my eyes fixed on my own trembling hands, unable to meet his gaze. Can I help you with something?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking in the dead silence of the store. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached out a hand that was coated in a thick black substance, either engine oil or dried, clotted blood, and placed a single crumpled $5 bill on the counter. His fingers were unnaturally long, the skin stretched tight over the bone, and the nails were jagged and black, as if they had been used to dig through frozen earth. He slowly leaned forward, the brim of his hat inches from my face. I could see his eyes then. They weren't human. They were milky white, clouded with cataracts and devoid of pupils, darting frantically in their sockets, as if they were seeing a different world than the one I was standing in. "It's still behind me," he rasped. His voice didn't sound like it came from a throat. It sounded like dry sandpaper grinding against rotting wood. "It followed me from the creek. Whatever you do, don't let it in when I leave. Lock the door the second I step out. Don't wait." He turned around with that same mechanical hitching movement and limped back toward the exit. I watched him through the glass, my hand already hovering over the manual lock. He got into the sedan, slammed the door, and the car screeched out of the lot, disappearing into the fog without ever turning on its blinkers. I didn't hesitate. I leapt over the counter, slammed the deadbolt home, and leaned my back against the door, gasping for air. As I looked out into the darkness, I saw a shape clinging to the roof of the sedan as it faded away. It looked like a person, but it was folded completely in half, its spine arched at an impossible angle. Its limbs were pale, translucent, and elongated, clinging to the metal roof with clawed feet that left deep gouges in the paint. It looked back at the station for a split second, its face a featureless mask of white skin. I backed away from the door, retreating into the middle of the store where the lights were brightest. I thought I was safe. But then, a soft, rhythmic tapping started. It wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the back of the store, the drive-through window that had been boarded up with thick plywood 5 years ago after a break-in. Tap, tap, tap. It was slow and deliberate. I stood frozen between the aisles of chips and soda, watching the plywood. A splintering sound echoed through the quiet room as a long, pale finger, the same bruised color as the creature on the car, poked through a gap in the wood. Then, the same raspy, grinding voice I had just heard from the man at the counter whispered through the wall, but this time the tone was different. It was wet, hungry, and far too close. "He forgot his change," the voice hissed, "and I'm still thirsty."
The plywood groaned as something began to pull it outward from the outside, the nails screeching as they were slowly pried from the frame. I realized then that the man hadn't been warning me about a monster following him. He was the bait, and I had just locked myself inside with the hunter. I've always been a runner, but Tangier at 4 a.m. is a different world than the one that tourists see. The salt air from the Mediterranean usually feels crisp and clean, but on this particular Tuesday, it felt heavy, sticking to my lungs like wet wool. I was finishing a 12-kilometer loop near the old Martian district, my footsteps echoing against the high stone walls of the villas. The streetlights were flickering, casting long, jerky shadows that seemed to dance just out of my peripheral vision. I checked my watch, 4:12 a.m., and adjusted my pace, eager to get back to the warmth of my apartment before the first call to prayer. That's when I heard the other pair of footsteps. They weren't rhythmic like mine. They were erratic. A quick burst of 3 steps, then a long, sliding drag. Thud, thud, thud. Shk. I slowed down, my heart rate spiking for a reason that had nothing to do with cardio. I didn't turn around immediately. I just drifted to the far side of the road near the edge of the cliff overlooking the sea. The footsteps mirrored me perfectly. When I slowed, they slowed. When I sped up, the dragging sound became more frantic, more desperate. I finally risked a glance over my shoulder. About 50 yards back, under a dying orange streetlight, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, and draped in a gray hooded jalaba that looked like it had been pulled from a shipwreck. The fabric was soaking wet, dripping onto the pavement in a dark pool. I couldn't see a face, just the void of the hood, but I could see the feet. They weren't wearing shoes. The skin was a bruised, waterlogged purple, and the toes were curled under the feet like claws, which explained the dragging sound. I didn't think, I just bolted. I've run marathons, but I've never felt my lungs burn the way they did in those next 5 minutes. I tore through the winding alleys of the Kasbah, banking on my knowledge of the shortcuts to lose whatever was behind me. But every time I turned a corner, that wet, rhythmic dragging sound was there, closer than before. Thud, 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 shk. It sounded like it was right at my heels, yet when I looked back, the alley behind me was empty. I reached my building, fumbling with my keys with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I slammed the heavy iron door and bolted it, leaning my forehead against the cool metal, gasping for air. I was safe. I lived on the 4th floor, and the building was a fortress. I walked up the stairs, my legs feeling like lead, and let myself into my flat. I headed straight for the kitchen to grab a glass of water, trying to convince myself it was just a local eccentric or a hallucination brought on by overtraining. I sat down on my sofa in the dark, staring out the window at the lights of the port. That's when I felt the cold. A sudden, bone-chilling draft swept through the room, carrying the overwhelming scent of rotting seaweed and old, stagnant salt water. My eyes drifted to the floor. Leading from my front door, across the tile, and stopping right at the edge of the sofa, was a trail of wet, muddy footprints. They weren't human. The toes were long, curled, and left deep, narrow gouges in the flooring. I realized then that the door hadn't opened because it hadn't. The trail didn't start at the door. It started at the wall. I sat frozen, unable to even blink. Then, from directly underneath the sofa I was sitting on, I heard a wet, gurgling inhalation. It sounded like someone trying to breathe through a throat full of seawater. A long purple finger, dripping with gray slime, slowly hooked around the edge of the cushion next to my thigh. A voice, thick with the sound of drowning, whispered from the floorboards, "You run so fast, but I am already home."